My rich uncle ignored me my whole life, but after he passed away, his lawyer revealed a secret that changed my future. My name is Serena. I am 30 years old, and until very recently, I believed that I was the least important person in my entire family. Not because I was unkind, not because I was difficult, not because I had done anything wrong. I believed it because I had been told so in 100 different ways for as long as I could remember, through the eyes of every adult who was supposed to love me. I had always been the extra one, the quiet one, the one nobody really needed to worry about. For a long time I accepted that. I folded myself small to fit into the space they gave me. I smiled when I was supposed to smile. I stayed quiet when speaking up would have made things uncomfortable. I learned how to disappear inside a room full of people who shared my blood. But there is something I need to tell you. The man who supposedly cared the least about me, the one who never once called on my birthday, who never asked how I was doing, who sat across from me at holiday dinners without so much as a glance in my direction. That man left me something that none of us ever expected, something that none of us fully understood until the day a lawyer sat down across from my family and began to read from a document that had been locked in a vault for 11 years. And what happened in that room changed everything. But before I get to that, I need to take you back to the beginning, because the ending of this story only makes sense when you understand where it started. And it started, as so many painful stories do, in a house that looked perfectly normal from the outside. I promise you, by the time I finish telling you this, you will understand why I spent years not telling anyone at all. Part 1. The House on Birchwood Lane. I grew up in a house on Birchwood Lane in a small city in the Midwest. The house was a 2-story colonial with a green front door and a garden my mother tended obsessively every spring. From the street, it looked like the kind of home where a family thrived. There were window boxes filled with flowers in summer, a basketball hoop in the driveway, and a porch where my parents would sometimes sit with glasses of lemonade on warm evenings. From the street, it looked like love lived there. But I learned early that appearances are architecture. They are designed to show the world what you want them to see, and nothing more. My parents were Gerald and Diane Calloway. My father worked in logistics management for a shipping company. My mother was a part-time bookkeeper who spent most of her energy running what she called the household, which mostly meant running us. They were not cruel people, not in the way that word is usually used. They did not shout every day. They did not break things. There were no dramatic scenes that a stranger walking through the door would have immediately recognized as wrong. What they did was quieter than that, subtler, and in some ways harder to explain to someone who has never lived inside it. I had an older brother named Daniel. He was 3 years older than me, broad-shouldered and confident in the way that some people simply are, as if the world agreed with their presence from the moment they arrived in it. Daniel was the kind of child that teachers praised without being asked to. He won awards. He brought home trophies. He made my parents laugh at the dinner table. And then there was me. I was not a troubled child. I was not disruptive. I got decent grades, read constantly, and preferred to be outdoors whenever I could. But I was not Daniel, and in my family, not being Daniel turned out to matter enormously. I noticed it in small things first. When Daniel brought home a B+ on a history test, my mother taped it to the refrigerator. When I brought home an A- the following week, she smiled and said that was nice and asked what I wanted for dinner. When Daniel missed curfew by 2 hours as a teenager, my father laughed it off and said boys would be boys. When I came home 30 minutes late from a study group, I was grounded for a week and told I had a responsibility to this family. These were not enormous injustices on their own. I know that. Children who have lived through genuinely terrible circumstances would rightly point out that missing a kind word about a test grade is not trauma. I am not trying to claim otherwise, but these small moments added up. The way water dripping steadily against stone eventually carves a hollow into it. And over the years, that hollow in me grew large and heavy. The one thing I never quite understood as a child was my uncle. My father's brother, Uncle Raymond, was a presence in our lives without ever fully being in our lives, if that makes sense. He existed at the edges of family gatherings. He would appear at Thanksgiving, sometimes at Christmas, occasionally at a birthday party when we were very young. He was tall, quiet, and impeccably dressed in a way that always made him look slightly out of place in my parents' living room. Raymond Calloway had made money. Real money. The kind that nobody in our branch of the family talked about directly, but that everyone clearly thought about constantly. He had started a small import business in his 30s and had quietly built it into something substantial over the decades. He drove a car that my father eyed with barely concealed envy. He wore a watch that my mother once asked about and then never mentioned again. He was, in every measurable way, the successful one. And he terrified my parents. Not literally, but there was a particular tension that entered the room whenever Raymond arrived. My father would stand straighter. My mother would become a slightly more polished version of herself. Daniel, who was naturally good at reading rooms, would perform his best self. Grades mentioned. Awards recalled. Plans for the future outlined with confidence. I, on the other hand, was mostly invisible to Raymond. Or at least, I believed I was. He rarely spoke to me directly. When he did, it was the polite kind of conversation an adult makes with a child they don't quite know what to do with. How is school going? Are you keeping busy? That sort of thing. There was no warmth in it. There was no particular coldness either. It was simply neutral, as if I were a guest in my own home who happened to share a last name with the people he actually came to see. By the time I was 15, I had stopped trying to make an impression on Raymond. He would sit across the room and speak mostly with my father and Daniel. He would accept my mother's cooking with gracious compliments, and then he would leave, and the house would return to its ordinary rhythms, and life would go on. I had no idea, at 15, that he was watching me far more carefully than I thought. I had no idea that he had been watching me for years. But I didn't know any of that yet, and what happened when I was 18 made me certain, beyond any doubt, that Raymond Calloway simply did not care whether I existed. Part 2. The night, everything shatter. I need to tell you about the night of my 18th birthday. This is the part of the story that I carried alone for a long time, the part that I rehearsed in my head so many times that it started to feel less like a memory and more like a film I had watched too many times, worn smooth at the edges. It was April. The weather had turned warm earlier than usual that year, and I remember the windows in the kitchen were open when I came downstairs in the morning. My mother was at the counter making coffee, and she turned when she heard me and said, "Happy birthday," in a voice that sounded like she was reminding herself to say it. Daniel was not home. He was in his first year of college by then, at a university 3 states away, studying business on a partial scholarship that my parents talked about frequently to anyone who would listen. His absence from the house had not made things worse between me and my parents. If anything, it had clarified something that I had always sensed but never wanted to name directly. Without Daniel there to be proud of, my parents weren't entirely sure what to do with me. I had been accepted to a small college about 2 hours away. It was not a prestigious school. It did not have the kind of name that made people's eyes light up when you mentioned it. But it had a strong education program, and I had wanted to be a teacher since I was 11 years old. I had applied, been accepted, and received a modest scholarship that would cover roughly half my costs. I had been building up the courage to talk to my parents about covering the rest for weeks. That morning, over coffee and toast, I finally did. I laid it out carefully. I showed them the acceptance letter. I showed them the financial aid package. I had even researched part-time job options near campus that could help me contribute. I explained that I wanted to go, that I had a plan, that I believed in it. My father listened with an expression I had seen before, politely closed, like a door that was technically open but had no space behind it. When I finished, he set down his coffee cup, and he said something I have never forgotten. He said, "Serena, we put everything into Daniel's education. We don't have anything left." I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "But Daniel got a scholarship." "And you said," "We said a lot of things," my mother said quietly, from the counter. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at her coffee. Things were different then. The conversation did not end dramatically. There was no shouting. There were no slammed doors. What happened instead was something worse. The conversation simply stopped. My father picked up the newspaper. My mother began clearing the dishes, and I sat at the table with my acceptance letter and my carefully prepared numbers and understood, in the particular way you understand things that you have always known but refuse to fully believe, that I was on my own. I spent the next 2 weeks trying different approaches. I asked again. I asked if we could sit down together and look at the numbers. I called the college to ask about payment plans. I looked into additional loans. I talked to my school counselor, who was sympathetic but could not conjure resources that did not exist. And then, at the end of those 2 weeks, something happened that I had not anticipated. My parents sat me down in the living room, and they told me that they thought it would be best if I found my own place to stay. Not in those words exactly. It was cushioned in language about independence and growing up and how this would be good for me in the long run. My father talked about how he had been out on his own at 18. My mother said something about how staying home was holding me back. There was even briefly a mention of a cousin who had done very well after being encouraged to be self-sufficient young. But the message was clear. I was being asked to leave. I had $340 in a savings account. A single suitcase of belongings I managed to pack in 1 hour, and a phone number for a girl from my high school, Mara, who had rented a room in an apartment near downtown and had once casually mentioned she might need a roommate someday. Someday turned out to be immediately. I called Mara. She said yes. And on a Tuesday afternoon in late April, exactly 11 days after my 18th birthday, I walked out of the house on Birchwood Lane with my suitcase and did not look back. I told myself I wasn't looking back because I was strong. The truth was that if I had turned around, I would not have been able to keep walking. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have known, was that someone had watched me pack that suitcase from a distance, someone who had been making a phone call to my parents the week before, trying to understand what was happening. Someone who had been told, by my father, that I was fine, that I was choosing this, that I wanted to go. Someone who believed that version of the story because he didn't know me well enough to know it wasn't true. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. That part comes later, part 3. Learning to survive Mara's apartment was a third-floor walk-up in a neighborhood that was generously described as transitional. The radiator clanged all winter. The windows let in a draft that no amount of towels stuffed into the frames could fully stop. The kitchen was so small that 2 people couldn't stand in it at the same time without touching. I loved it. I loved it fiercely and immediately in the way you love the first thing that is entirely yours, imperfect and all. I found a job within a week. 2, actually. I worked mornings at a coffee shop 3 blocks from the apartment, 5 days a week, opening shift starting at 5:30 in the morning, and I picked up weekend hours at a grocery store nearby, stocking shelves on Saturday and Sunday afternoons. Between the 2 jobs, I could cover my share of the rent, my groceries, and a bus pass. Sometimes there is a little left over. Not often, but sometimes. The college plan was not gone, it was delayed. I told myself that every single day, because on the days when I didn't tell myself, the fear crept in. The fear that delayed meant dead. That the life I had imagined for myself was already receding. Mara was kind in the offhand, practical way that some people are kind. She didn't ask a lot of questions about my family. She brought home takeout containers and left them in the fridge with sticky notes that said things like, "Eat this." I already had some. She laughed easily and loudly and did not require me to perform happiness when I didn't feel it. For someone in my situation, that kind of uncomplicated decency was worth more than she probably knew. I enrolled in 1 community college course that fall. Just 1, because 1 was all I could afford. I chose Introduction to Child Development because it was connected to what I eventually wanted to do, and because it met twice a week in the evenings after my coffee shop shift. I sat in those classes still smelling faintly of espresso and took notes until my hand cramped. I got an A. The following semester, I took 2 courses. The semester after that, 3. It was slow. It was not the traditional path, but it was mine, and I was building it 1 carefully placed stone at a time. I did not speak to my parents during this period. Not once. There were no calls, no letters, no holiday visits. I know that might sound dramatic. I know some people would say, family is family and you should always leave the door open. But the door on Birchwood Lane had been closed by them, not by me, and I was spending too much energy simply surviving to spend any of it knocking on doors that had been deliberately shut. Daniel called once, about 4 months after I left. He had heard from my parents that I had moved out, and he wanted to make sure I was okay. The conversation was short and uncomfortable, the way conversations are when one person knows more than they're saying. He said Mom and Dad were doing well. He said he hoped I was settling in. He did not say he thought they'd been wrong to push me out. He did not say he was sorry. He said, "Let me know if you need anything," and then we both knew, without saying so, that I would not call and he would not follow up. That was the last time Daniel and I spoke for many years. My contact with Uncle Raymond during this period was non-existent. He did not call, he did not reach out. As far as I knew, he was not aware of the specifics of my situation, or if he was, he had decided it was not his concern. This did not particularly surprise me. Raymond had never shown any special interest in my life. Why would he start now? I thought about him occasionally, not with warmth, exactly, but with a kind of curious detachment. He was wealthy, he was family, and yet he had never once offered a hand. There was something almost instructive in that, I thought, something that taught me, without words, that blood was not the same thing as loyalty, and that closeness was measured in action, not in shared last names. I filed him away in the category of things I did not think about because thinking about them did not help. And then I got on with the business of building a life. Part forward. The slow building of something. Our real years moved differently in that period of my life. When you are working constantly and studying whenever you can and sleeping in short, careful shifts, time does not flow so much as accumulate. You look up and realize that a year has passed. You look up again and realize it has been 3. By the time I was 22, I had completed my associate's degree at the community college and been accepted to transfer to a state university to finish my bachelor's in early childhood education. The transfer scholarship they offered covered most of my tuition. I took out a small loan for the rest, cried briefly about it, and then signed the paperwork. I moved to a city 2 hours from where I had been living. I found a room in a shared house with 4 other students. I reduced my hours at the coffee shop to mornings only and picked up a part-time position as an aide in a preschool classroom 3 afternoons a week. The children in that classroom became, without exaggeration, one of the central joys of my life. There is something about small children that cuts through everything. They do not care about your history. They do not know your family's opinion of you. They need you to be present, patient, and consistent. And when you are those things, they give you back something that I can only describe as pure. A 4-year-old running to you with a painting they've made with their entire body pressed into the effort of it is a kind of medicine that nothing else I have ever encountered has replicated. I graduated with my bachelor's degree on a Saturday in May when I was 24 years old. Mara drove 2 hours to sit in the bleachers and wave a homemade sign with my name on it. My faculty advisor shook my hand and told me I was going to be an exceptional teacher. I walked across that stage with no family in the audience, and I smiled, genuinely, because the person I had become had been built entirely by my own hands, and I was proud of her. I accepted a teaching position at an elementary school in the city where I had finished my degree. I taught 2nd grade. I was good at it. I knew I was good at it, not because anyone told me so, although they did, but because I could feel it in the room. I could feel the difference between a child who was struggling to understand something and a child who was moments away from understanding it, and I knew how to be present in that space. I knew how to make the space safe enough for understanding to arrive. I rented my own apartment for the first time at 25. A 1-bedroom on the 4th floor of a building with a lobby that had a plant in it that someone actually watered. The first night I slept there, I lay on the floor because my bed hadn't arrived yet, and I looked at the ceiling and I felt something I had not expected to feel. Peaceful. Not happy, exactly. Not triumphant, just peaceful. As if the long, difficult thing had not ended, but had shifted. As if I had climbed far enough up the mountain that the air was different. I did not tell my parents about the apartment. I did not tell them about the job. I did not tell them about any of it, not because I was punishing them, but because I had built this life in their absence, and introducing them to it felt like letting strangers tour a home. They had no hand in building. The house on Birchwood Lane existed somewhere in the past, and I had learned to leave the past in the past. At least, I thought I had. I had no way of knowing that the past was about to come looking for me, and I had no way of knowing that it would arrive in the form of a phone call about a man I had written off years ago. Part 5. The call I didn't expect. I was in my classroom on a Wednesday afternoon when my phone rang. I didn't answer it during school hours, so it went to voicemail. I had a meeting after school that ran long, and then I went to the grocery store. And it wasn't until I was home and sitting at my kitchen table with a bowl of pasta that I finally listened to the message. The voice on the recording was male, professional, unhurried in the way that suggests the person speaking is accustomed to delivering information that carries weight. He said his name was Martin Ashby. He said he was an attorney with Ashby and Connell, a firm based in Chicago. He said he was reaching out on behalf of the estate of Raymond Gerald Calloway, who had passed away 11 days prior following a brief illness. I put down my fork. I had not heard from anyone in my family in years. The news that Raymond had died reached me through a lawyer's voicemail, which told me everything I needed to know about how my family had processed my absence. No one had called. No one had thought, when Raymond died, that perhaps Serena should know. I was not in that loop. I had not been for a long time. The attorney's voice continued. He said that Mr. Calloway's estate included provisions that specifically named me as a beneficiary. He said this was the reason he was reaching out directly. He said he would appreciate a return call at my earliest convenience. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after the message ended. I played it again. Then a third time. I tried to understand what I was hearing. Raymond had named me in his will. Raymond, who had sat at holiday dinners without ever quite looking at me. Raymond, who had spoken to me in the polite and distant way of someone making obligatory conversation. Raymond, who, as far as I could tell, had paid me approximately the same level of attention he might pay to a piece of furniture in a room he visited occasionally. That Raymond had named me in his will. I did not sleep well that night. I turned it over and over, looking for the explanation that made sense. Perhaps it was a small bequest, a token, something symbolic, the kind of thing people leave to distant relatives to feel they've been thorough. Perhaps there was a condition attached, something I would need to do or agree to that would make the whole thing fall apart before it began. I called Martin Ashby the following morning. He answered on the second ring. His voice was exactly as it had sounded on the recording. Calm, deliberate, like a man who had done this many times and understood that the person on the other end of the line needed information delivered with care. He asked me if I could come to Chicago for a formal reading of the will. He said there were several beneficiaries, and that the terms of the estate required all named parties to be present. I asked him, very carefully, who else would be there. There was a brief pause. He said that my parents, Gerald and Diane Calloway, would be present, and that my brother Daniel Calloway would also be present. I stood in my kitchen, holding my phone against my ear, and felt something move through me that was difficult to name. Not dread, exactly. Not excitement. Something more complicated than either of those. The feeling of standing at the edge of something that you can't yet see the bottom of. I told Martin Ashby I would be there. He gave me a date and an address. He thanked me for returning his call. After I hung up, I sat down on my kitchen floor, which is something I do when I need to think clearly. I don't know why the floor helps. It just does. I sat there, and I thought about what it would mean to walk into a room with my parents after all these years. To sit across from Daniel, to be in the presence of people who had, in their various ways, made me feel like the one who didn't quite count. And then I thought about Raymond, about all those years of what I had interpreted as indifference, about the quiet man who had sat at holiday tables and never quite met my eyes. What had he seen? What had he known? And why, after all this time, had he left me anything at all? I didn't have those answers yet, but I was about to find out, and what I would learn would rewrite everything I thought I understood about my family, about my uncle, and about my own story. Part 6. Chicago. I drove to Chicago on a Thursday morning. It was November, and the sky was the particular flat gray of Midwestern winters. The kind of sky that doesn't threaten anything in particular, but reminds you that warmth is a memory and a promise, not a current reality. The offices of Ashby and Connell were in a glass building downtown. The lobby had marble floors and the kind of quiet that money buys. A receptionist directed me to a conference room on the 14th floor. I took the elevator alone. I had worn my good coat, a charcoal wool that I had bought 2 years ago for parent-teacher conferences, and my hands inside my gloves were cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. The conference room had a long table and windows overlooking the city. There were already people inside when I arrived. My mother saw me first. Diane Calloway had aged, not drastically, not devastatingly, but the years had settled into her face in ways that changed it. Her hair was grayer. The lines around her eyes were deeper. She was wearing a blue blouse that I remembered from years ago, or one very similar to it, and she looked at me with an expression I could not immediately read. Then she said, "Serena. Just my name, nothing else." My father turned. Gerald Calloway was broader than I remembered, heavier across the shoulders, his hair fully white now where it had been salt and pepper when I last saw him. He looked at me with an expression that was almost formal, as if we were acquaintances who had met at a professional event. And then there was Daniel. Daniel was 33 now. He had grown into his confidence completely, the way some people do, as if time had simply confirmed what they always suspected about themselves. He was well dressed in a jacket and pressed shirt. He smiled when he saw me, a smile that was genuine but careful. "Serena," he said, "you look great." "So do you," I said. We did not hug. Martin Ashby arrived 2 minutes later. He was younger than I had expected, mid-40s, with reading glasses and the leather folder. He apologized for the delay, took a seat at the head of the table, and arranged his papers with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times. We all sat. My mother sat across from me. My father sat beside her. Daniel was to my right. I was aware of the geography of the room in a way that felt almost physical, the arrangement of people and history and unresolved things. Martin Ashby opened his folder. He said that he had served as Raymond Calloway's attorney for 19 years. He said that the will he was about to read had been drafted 11 years ago and had not been amended since. He said that Mr. Calloway had been precise in his intentions and that the document reflected those intentions clearly. He looked around the table, and then he began to read Part 7, the reading of the will. The first provisions were straightforward. Raymond had left charitable bequests to several organizations, amounts I won't share specifically because they aren't what the story is about. He had left personal items to a small number of friends. He had made arrangements for his home to be sold, with the proceeds distributed in a particular way. My parents shifted in their seats during this section, waiting, calculating. I could see it in the way my father held very still and my mother's hands were folded too tightly on the table. Daniel, to his credit, appeared genuinely patient. He sat with his hands loose on the arms of his chair and watched Martin Ashby with an expression of focused attention. Then Martin Ashby paused. He looked at a specific section of the document more carefully than he had looked at the others. He lifted his reading glasses slightly, and then he said, "With respect to the principal assets of the estate, including the investment portfolio, the business interests, and the sum currently held in the Raymond Calloway Trust, the following distribution has been directed." The room was very quiet. To Daniel Gerald Calloway, the sum of $50,000 is bequeathed in recognition of his relationship with the decedent. My father exhaled. My mother's head moved slightly as if she were recalculating something. Daniel nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said quietly. "To no one in particular." Martin Ashby continued. To Gerald Arthur Calloway and Diane Calloway, the sum of $25,000 is bequeathed jointly, with the following note from the decedent. He paused to read the note. It was brief. Raymond had written, in his own words, that he had loved his brother and hoped that this gift would be received in the spirit in which it was given. My father looked like he was being careful not to show his reaction. My mother pressed her lips together. Then Martin Ashby turned a page, and the room changed. The remainder of the estate, he said, including the full balance of the Raymond Calloway Trust, the investment portfolio valued at current market rates, and the primary business interest, is bequeathed in its entirety to Serena Marie Calloway. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It was the silence of people who could not immediately process what they had heard. I heard my mother make a small sound, not a word, just a sound. My father turned and looked at me. His expression was something I had never seen on his face before. It was not anger. It was not warmth. It was something that looked, from the outside, like bewilderment. Daniel turned as well. His careful expression had cracked open just slightly. He was staring at me with something that might have been shock, or might have been something more complicated than shock, and I sat very still, with my hands in my lap, and waited for Martin Ashby to continue. He set the document down and looked at the table. "There is also," he said, "an accompanying letter, which Mr. Parton, Calloway directed, should be read aloud at this meeting. He specified that he wanted all parties to hear it together. He picked up a separate envelope. He opened it with precise hands. He removed a folded sheet of paper, and he began to read my uncle's words in his measured, unhurried voice. And what Raymond had written changed everything I thought I understood. Part 8. A late Raymond's letter. Dear family, if this letter is being read, then I am gone. And if I know Martin, he's reading it exactly as I asked, with everyone in the room. That was intentional. Please bear with me. I have spent most of my life as an observer. Some people move through the world loudly. I preferred to watch, to listen, and to wait before drawing conclusions. I learned early that the loudest version of a story is rarely the truest one. I have watched this family for a long time. I watched Gerald build something he was proud of, and I respected that. I watched Diane hold a household together with considerable effort, and I respected that too. I watched Daniel find his footing in the world with a confidence that served him well, and I respected him for it. And I watched Serena. I want to explain what I saw, because I don't believe anyone else was looking as carefully as I was. I saw a child who was curious and quiet in the way that intelligent people often are when they are surrounded by noise that doesn't include them. I saw a young person who was not celebrated, not because she wasn't worth celebrating, but because the room's attention was already fully occupied. I saw, at family gatherings, a girl who would sit near the window and read, or who would help clear the dishes without being asked, or who would listen to conversations that adults were having without interjecting, and I thought, this one is paying attention. This one is taking notes. This one is building something inside herself that the rest of us aren't seeing yet. I want to be honest about something. When Serena was 18, I called Gerald. I had heard indirectly that there was a situation, that she had left the house. I wanted to understand what had happened. Gerald told me she had chosen to leave, that she wanted to be independent, that she was fine. I believed him. I should not have believed him without asking more questions. I should not have accepted one person's version of a story about someone who deserved to have her own version heard. I am sorry for that, Serena. Genuinely and without reservation. If I had known the truth of what happened in that house, the decisions I made in the years that followed would have looked different. But I did not know. And time passed, and I watched from a distance as you built something anyway, without help, without the advantages your brother had, without the support of the people who should have given it most freely. I have tracked your career quietly. I hope that does not seem strange. I know you teach second grade. I know you have been recognized 3 times by your school district for excellence. I know you coached a reading group for struggling students on Saturdays for 2 years without extra pay. I know these things because I took the time to know them in the way that I should have taken the time to know you. You may wonder why I did not reach out. I have asked myself that question more times than I can count. The honest answer is that I was a coward in this one specific way. I was afraid that the distance had calcified, that too much time had passed, that my reaching out would seem like intrusion, or would open wounds that you had healed at great cost, or that you would, rightfully, want nothing from me. So instead, I did the thing that was available to me to do. I made a decision, and I made it 11 years ago, and I did not change it. Not once, and all the time between then and now. The world did not give you a fair start, Serena. I cannot fix that. But I can give you what I have. I can give you the kind of foundation that no one gave you when you needed it. Not as an apology, exactly, though it carries some of that. As a recognition. As my way of saying, I saw you, I always saw you, and you were worth seeing. I hope you use it well. I suspect you will. With love. Raymond, Part 9. The Aftermath. Martin Ashby folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table in front of him. He did not say anything immediately. He gave the room time. I was looking at my hands, not because I couldn't look up, but because I needed a moment to put my face together before I did. Because what I felt in that moment was not triumph. It was not vindication, exactly, though there was something adjacent to that. What I felt was grief. Clean and sharp and unexpected. I grieved for the version of Raymond who had watched from a distance and been too afraid to bridge it. I grieved for the 18-year-old who had walked out of a house with a suitcase and no idea that anyone had seen her clearly. I grieved for all the years when I had written him off as indifferent, not understanding that what looked like indifference was something else entirely. And I grieved, in a complicated way I am still working through, for what my family had failed to be. I looked up. My mother was crying. Not loudly, small, controlled tears that she was pressing away with her fingertips. Her eyes, when they met mine, held something I had not seen in them, directed at me in a very long time, something that looked like remorse. My father was not crying, he was very still. He looked older than he had when I walked in. He looked like a man who was understanding, in real time, the full weight of a choice he had made 12 years ago. The choice to tell his brother a comfortable version of the truth instead of the real one. The choice that had, it turned out, been held against him in a very quiet, very private way for 11 years. I wondered if he understood that Raymond had known. That Raymond had made the decision he made not in ignorance of what had happened, but with full awareness of it, that the letter was not just a gift to me, it was also a message to them. Daniel was looking at the table. His jaw was tight. I could see the effort it was taking him to sit in that chair and process what had just happened. What he was feeling, I could not fully say, but for the first time in my life, I watched my brother absorb something that had not gone the way everyone had always expected things to go for him, and I felt no pleasure in it, only a tired, complicated sympathy. Martin Ashby explained the practical details quietly and efficiently. There were documents to sign. There would be an appraisal process for the business interests. There was a meeting he would schedule with me separately to walk through the specifics of the trust and the portfolio. He said the total value of the estate, including all assets, was currently estimated at just over $4 million. My mother made that small sound again. My father put his hand over his mouth. I absorbed that number the way you absorb very large things, by not quite letting yourself believe it all at once. $4 million. To a woman who had spent 12 years building a life on careful budgeting and delayed gratification and the stubborn, patient conviction that she was worth something even when no one was saying so. I signed the papers Martin Ashby placed in front of me. My hands were steady. I don't know why they were steady, but they were. When the meeting concluded, we all stood. The room arranged itself the way rooms do at the end of difficult events. People reached for their coats. Papers were gathered. My mother moved toward me before I reached the door. She stood in front of me and she looked at me, and she said, "I know sorry isn't enough." I looked at her for a long moment. "No," I said, "it isn't." And then, because I am not a person who closes doors completely unless I have to, I said, "But it's a place to start." I left the conference room. I took the elevator down alone. I crossed the marble lobby and walked out into the gray November air of Chicago, and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment with my face tipped up slightly toward the flat gray sky. And I breathed. Part 10. What came after the weeks that followed were both overwhelming and strangely mundane. Meeting with Martin Ashby, learning the structure of the trust, being introduced to Raymond's business partners who were gracious and professional and seemed, genuinely, to have respected my uncle deeply. I continued teaching. This was not a financial necessity anymore, but it was a different kind of necessity. The children in my classroom did not know about any of this. To them, I was just their teacher, the one who left encouraging notes on their reading journals, and who kept a jar of colored pencils on the window ledge, and who read to them after lunch in a particular voice they seemed to like. I was not willing to give that up. I was not sure I would ever be willing to give that up. I began working with a financial advisor, a patient woman named Claire, who did not talk down to me and who seemed genuinely pleased to explain things until I understood them. I made decisions carefully. I did not make large decisions quickly. I created a financial plan that felt aligned with who I was and what I actually wanted, rather than with any imagined version of what a person who suddenly has resources should want. I set up a scholarship fund. This was the first thing I did that felt entirely, unambiguously right. I named it after no one, because I didn't want it to be about any particular person, including Raymond. I wanted it to be about the thing itself. The fund supports first-generation college students who are navigating their education without family financial help. Every year, it provides full tuition coverage for 3 students at the state university where I finished my degree. The first year it was awarded, one of the recipients sent me a handwritten note. She was 19. She had been working 2 jobs and taking 1 class at a time. She wrote that she had been starting to believe she would not make it. I kept that note in the drawer of my bedside table. My relationship with my parents evolved slowly and carefully, like a plant that has been root-bound for a long time and needs a new container, more space. before it can grow in a new direction. My mother and I spoke on the phone first. Short calls, then longer ones. There was no dramatic reconciliation scene. No tearful dinner where everything was said and forgiven in an evening. Real repair doesn't work that way, in my experience. It is a series of smaller moments. A call returned that wasn't strictly necessary. A question asked with genuine curiosity rather than obligation. A silence that is comfortable rather than loaded. My father was harder. He is still harder. Some things he said and did not say have sat between us for a long time, and I am not sure all of them will fully dissolve. But he is trying. I can see that he is trying. And for now, that is enough. Daniel and I have perhaps surprised ourselves the most. We had lunch together in the spring after the will reading, at a restaurant halfway between where we each lived. We talked for 3 hours. He told me things he had never told me, about what growing up in that house looked like from his side, about the pressure he had felt to perform, to always be the excellent one, and how that pressure had shaped him in ways he was still sorting out, about the guilt he had carried, quietly, for years, about the way things had gone when I was 18. I told him things too, about what it had been like, about what the early years were like, about Mara and her sticky notes and the radiator that clanged all winter and the first time I walked across a stage with no family in the bleachers. He cried a little. Just briefly. He pressed the back of his hand to his eyes and looked out the window and then looked back at me. I should have done more, he said. You were 21, I said, and you were also living in that family. I did not absolve him. But I did not condemn him either. I gave him the thing that I was slowly learning to give myself, a complex and honest account, without the need to flatten it into something simpler than it actually was. We have had lunch 4 more times since then. Each time has been easier than the last. As for Raymond, I had spent a lot of time thinking about Raymond. I visited his grave in the spring. I brought flowers, which felt slightly performative, but also genuine, which I think is the nature of most gestures made to the dead. I stood there for a while. I thought about the man who had sat at holiday tables and never quite looked at me, and who had apparently all along been looking very carefully. I thought about what it costs to be a careful watcher instead of a participant. I thought about how many years he had spent making mental notes about my life without ever making a phone call, about how the letter he left behind was both a beautiful act of recognition and also, in its way, a kind of extended apology for the years of silence. I think Raymond was, in the end, a man who cared more than he showed, and who was limited by his own difficulty with vulnerability. He expressed his care the way he knew how to express it, through action rather than presence, through provision rather than conversation. It was not the way I would have chosen. It was not what I needed from him when I was young. But it was real. And it was his. I have accepted it as the complicated gift it was. Part 11. What I now. If you are watching this, or listening to this, and you have come from a family that made you feel like the extra one, the one who didn't quite count, the one standing slightly outside the warmth of the room, I want to say something directly to you. Your family's assessment of you is not the final assessment. I spent years living inside the story that my family had written about me. The unremarkable one. The one who didn't need much. The one who would be fine on her own, who had no particular future that anyone needed to invest in. I absorbed that story so deeply that there were years when I told myself the same things they told me because it had become the only available version of the truth. But a story isn't true just because it's the one being told the most loudly. The thing I know now, that I wish I had known at 18 with my suitcase and my $340, is that being underestimated is a form of freedom, though a painful one. When no one is watching, you can do things at your own pace, in your own way, without performing for anyone's approval. The girl sitting near the window reading at the family gathering is not the lesser one. She is the one storing things up. She is the one building a self that no one else will have to validate for her, because she will have built it herself. Raymond saw that. I am grateful he saw it, even if it took me years to understand that he had. I did not need what he left me. Not in the fundamental sense. I had built a life I was proud of, a life that felt entirely mine, before that phone call ever came. The resources he left have allowed me to do more, to amplify what was already there, to give to others in ways I could not have managed before. but the person I am. The person who stood in that conference room with steady hands and read a letter from a dead man and did not fall apart. That person was built long before Raymond's estate became part of the picture. She was built in Mara's drafty apartment. She was built during early morning coffee shop shifts and evening community college classes smelling of espresso. She was built across a graduation stage with no family in the bleachers. She was built in a second-grade classroom, one reading group, one patient explanation, one small believing relationship at a time. That is the person I am, and I am no longer the least important person in any room. I am Serena. I am 30 years old, and I have learned, the long hard way, and also the unexpectedly beautiful way, that the people who see you most clearly are sometimes the ones who never said a word, and that you yourself, all along, were worth seeing. If this story resonated with you, please consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it. Leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever been the one standing just outside the warmth of the room, I hope you know that your story isn't finished yet. Like and subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this one. Thank you for being here.